if you're interested, we do have some lovely ginger snaps, and Moo's brought homemade
alfalfa
and chips. So thank you, Moose, for bringing that. Very, very, very nice. Oh, and I'm so sorry. Jonathan brought. You got it.
And I'm thinking about rationing this out. I also have the Twinkie cookbook.
Oh, wow.
My favorite recipe is Twinkie sushi. This is remarkable, I'll tell you.
That is going to be an awesome raffle prize at the next meeting. Oh, okay. So once again, welcome. So glad that you're here. So glad that we have our guests here. I'm excited to hear from her in a little bit. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce ourselves, and we're just going to share what our favorite all-time movie is. This favorite all-time movie. So what we're going to do first, think about it. I'm going to start with Susan. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Susan Beal, and my favorite movie of all time is Real Genius. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. Yeah, it's such a good one. You ready?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. My favorite movie. Brian Falter. What popped in my mind was Old Yeller. Yeah.
Jonathan Kane, the board president. One of these movies. Sand Pebbles?
You have to put that one on my Netflix queue.
I'm Sharon Hatch. I gotta take a pass. I really don't have a favorite movie.
We're going to have to work on that.
Okay.
All right.
I know.
So, Cat West, and my favorite movie, since I'm such a sci-fi fan, is The Fifth Element.
Yes! So I am gonna go. I think that the best acting and narratives right now are currently in long form series. So I'm actually gonna shift a little bit and say season 1 of Westworld.
Ooh, okay. Who are you?
I'm Matt Otis. I'm the chair of the Richmond Neighborhood Association.
There you go.
I'm Rob Mumford. I'm on the board. I am a Star Wars nerd, so I would say Empire Strikes Back.
Good answer.
Eric Matthews. I like Blade Runner either.
Brendan?
pick a favorite, but I'd say the Royal Tenenbaums is up there.
And who are you?
The what?
I'm Brendan Haggard.
The what,
Royal
Brendan?
The
Tenenbaums.
Royal Tenenbaums.
I'm Lauren Scher, and I was a cinema studies major, so I have a lot of but I guess the one I'll always watch if it's on TV is Shawshank Redemption.
Ooh,
Nice.
I'm Bill Cunningham with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. One-time Richmond neighborhood resident. All-time favorite movie is a tough one. But the first thing that popped into my mind tonight was Wings of Desire. It's set in Berlin. Angels wander around rooftops, listen to people, and it's just kind of an interesting urban kind of movie.
That sounds great. I love that. Kathleen.
I'm Kathleen Taylor. I'm the state senator for this area here. Thank you for having me tonight. And the way we were, that's my, I'm a romantic.
Nice.
I'm David Binnig. I'll say Rear Window.
Hitchcock fan.
Gray, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh, yes.
Heather Flint Shadow. So tough to choose between It's a Wonderful Life, Casablanca, probably I was going to say. But it makes me think of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington because you're here.
Nice.
Callie Jones, former board member, and I was going to say Blade Runner 2.
Do it.
But my other favorite's Amelie.
You look like her, so good choice.
High praise. And next we're going to give you money.
I would say 2001, but I don't know. I might go with Casablanca.
Nice.
Bruce Lohman, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Andrea Brown, The Darjeeling Limited.
What is it?
The Darjeeling Limited.
Huh.
Wes Anderson.
Okay.
That's why Brendan said
Denise here, and every time I think I have a favorite, then I go watch it, and it's not as good as I think. So, I'm sort of afraid to name anything. But a movie I saw recently that I liked a lot is Wind River.
That's how I feel about ex-boyfriends when I talk to them again. I'm like, yeah.
I like Second Chances, so I like Baghdad Cafe.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Moves up south, southeast uplift. My favorite movie changes pretty much every month, but currently it's Crazy Rich Asians.
Oh, nice.
Gordon Hillis Land, Doctor Zhivago.
Oh, yes. Classic.
Then Janetta Coben. Kill a Mockingbird and Casablanca keep tearing each other apart in my head. So, To Kill a Mockingbird tonight.
Yeah, perfect. All right, thank you. And if you have a new movie to add to your Netflix queue, you can thank me.
Hey, Kat. I'll introduce myself.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Hi there. The disembodied voice coming from the phone here is, from the microphone, is Crystal Brim, board member. And I think one of my very favorite movies, I see it at least once a year when it's shown in the theaters. Usually they're the Miyazaki film series, and I always go and see Kiki's Delivery Service when it's shown subtitled. I love that movie. I'll see it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal. And is Alan on the phone as well?
He had to go pick up his dad from dialysis.
Oh.
So he's gonna check in when he can. May I ask if it's all right if I text him just topics that we're on?
Oh, yeah, you can do.
And if you can ask him what his favorite movie is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's sure. Okay, thanks everyone.
We forgot to turn the lights off in the back. So what's up on the washed out screen is our overall agenda. The next thing on the item is reports from committees and so forth. And I think one of the first ones up was going to be Susan. Or Susan, if you want to wait and be the closer, you can do that too. All right, let me see if I can get the right light working this. All right. Go ahead and tell people what you were up to with the, well, and Kathleen, you can tell them too. So, the diesel committee, or I can't remember the exact name of it.
So just last week I got to see Senator Taylor on the panel at the Diesel Town Hall in Brooklyn at the Sacred Heart Church. Did anyone else attend? It was an amazing evening. I was one of the outer organizers and just more of a connector to our neighborhood and a supporter, but really appreciated the amazing job that they put together a stellar list of doctors and medical professionals who had very just really impactful science to share, and then our elected officials and our city council candidate who spoke represented city, county, and state levels as well as regional, and it was just a really, with the metro presence, it just had, there was a lot of hope and a lot of public policy answers to really honestly challenging air quality questions that all of us are living in. So I wrote an article about it for the RNA newsletter that comes out in a couple weeks. Thank you, Rob. And that will share a lot more, but I just wanted to say how much it meant to be part of such an engaged community and how many people really are so concerned about this, and the prevailing feeling was leaving with some hope that we can band together, we can stay in touch with our elected officials, that Metro cares, that they're working with the agencies who may be understaffed to work on flexibility and options, that there are even some civilian-driven ideas like Chris Eikamp of the Hand neighborhood has created the sensor bot, which is for under $50 you can build essentially a birdhouse you can put on your property. He also has a plastic bottle version that's even less expensive, but it does incredibly sophisticated air quality tracking, uploads all the data to a central server, and can be used very in tandem with official efforts, so that there are ways that we may be able to finally answer these questions that we've all had that have felt daunting and overwhelming, that there's positive change coming and that our representatives are really equally concerned and working hard on it. So if anybody does have any questions and wants to talk at the break, I'd be happy to, but the article in a few weeks will have a lot more information and all the links that they shared that were really great for further action. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate the chance to be, Sharon and I were able to attend as the Richmond delegation, and we were really thankful to be there. Not necessarily, happy to see these types of maps, but
That looks very pretty.
I mean, as long as our neighborhood school isn't like right there, it should be good.
yeah, our
That's
mutual
Abernathy.
neighborhood school's right there. But
So, all right. Thank you very much, Susan. Any other reports from committees or groups or something like that? Callie, yes.
So you didn't have to look up. Richmond Ready, I'm Callie Jones, and we are busy, and we have lots of exciting projects in the works. One of which we want to replicate Richmond School's Barrel fundraiser, and we're talking about piggybacking on the Richmond Cleanup Day. So
Okay.
I don't know how I'm supposed to formally present that, or if I have to come to and get on the agenda and come to a meeting and have a vote. I don't know, so maybe you can tell me.
So how to get on, so what is your request? Can you give me a
That
little
we
bit
would
more?
like to do the barrel
Okay.
fundraiser, water barrel fundraiser. They're 55-gallon water barrels for storing
Okay.
water. And we would like to sell that as a fundraiser
Okay,
at the Richmond neighborhood cleanup, because there's a lot of land on that property. And it would help bring more traffic through to the cleanup and the rummage sale.
Sweet.
So I think, the more the merrier. It becomes a very community
and you said that was partnering also with Richmond Elementary?
Richmond's doing it now, and
Okay.
they're sharing, they're being very,
Okay.
wonderful and sharing their information with us, and they know we wanna do it.
Yeah.
They're doing theirs now,
Yeah.
and we're doing ours 6 months later, so we're
Okay.
not stepping
Sell
on toes.
55-gallon drums at the exit.
Yep, and Susan got the contact for me, and I called them right away.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of, we can get that going.
All right, that sounds great.
More in the fiscal sponsorship about that. We're also working to find out what the tool library has, to see if we can support them in any way, for more, not a lot, but preparedness tools there. The idea is we're trying to enable our neighbors to help themselves, so we have to put the pieces out there to allow people to do that.
Yeah.
Also talking about this idea that we're still trying to figure out a good name for, but I've been calling them empowerment sets.
Okay.
And those are sets that are on certain preparedness topics that people can sign out. So when you have a block party or a potluck and you want to talk about preparedness, there's a set that already has material there for you to get going. It's not overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's kind of like those library sets with books and kits in them.
Yeah.
Discovery
Yeah.
kits. Yeah. So that's what we're doing that. So
All
we're
right,
working,
excellent.
working away.
I don't know, do you wanna let him add his 2 bits about earthquake?
I know Jonathan's all about wrenches.
Okay. No.
Oh.
Because I was a net team leader
Yes,
and
I
blah, blah,
know.
blah. That's how we put on a couple workshops, years ago and trying to seismic retrofitting and all that kind of stuff in the houses. I got some good news from that. But gas leaks
Yes.
is probably the biggest single danger. Because if they start going, oh boy, you're in deep doo-doo. So I went around, I actually got about 30 or 40 of these and gave these turn-offs, external turn-offs, right outside your house by the meter to my neighbors. And they would say, oh, that's so nice of you. I said, I'm doing it for entirely selfish reasons. Because if your house starts to go and any kind of a wind is going to blow into mine, mine's going to go. But there's some disadvantages.
Yes.
If you're not at home. And when the earthquake hits, you may forget, get out there in time or so forth. My neighbor, a couple houses down, got an automatic shut-off. They now have automatic gas shut-offs you have to install, but they differentiate between a big truck going by and the actual quake. But when Kat and I were talking about this, we said perhaps the Richmond Neighborhood Association should, a committee or a couple people get together and shop around and see if there's any vendor or whatever that can give us a discount for a large number.
And that's where I actually wanna stop you. and say that I kind of like this idea. Part of what we're going to work on towards the end is the moving forward workshop, and that's one of the potential ideas for things that we could do as a neighborhood
I
association
do
too.
wanna throw something
do a little
quickly
bit.
out there, I'm not sure they're handing them out anymore because they don't want people to turn off their gas.
Please.
Yeah,
Interesting.
so
Well,
there's
it's gonna give us
there's a
away for
reason, you
$5.
just presented the good reasons to turn off your gas, but there's other reasons not to.
So,
So, I don't know,
Excellent.
but something to look into.
all right. Are there any other committees that I've forgotten that need to go? All right, Heather.
Okay, so, for the Division Design Initiative, we're not a committee, but we're a project,
Mhm.
subcommittee. So we got, Hawthorne to also unanimously adopt our grassroots-led project of our Division Main Street Design Guidelines. And so one of the things that we're needing to work with them next on is identifying their key sites and special buildings, which is what we've done. But it's something that would be a great opportunity to engage our new board and our community about what are those special places on Hawthorne that we care about, and what are those key sites that are likely to redevelop and what might be some special goals. We have done some of the key sites work for Division, but we didn't kind of take it to its full extent to get that adopted in terms of the goals for the key sites. So that's an opportunity for us to kind of tie up that last piece for Division as well as to do it for Hawthorne.
Okay.
We met with Marty from the city, our neighborhood liaison, and with Laura Willard, who is the project manager for the new DOZA implementation. It's the design overlay zoning amendments, which sounds really long, little dozy. But it's really important because it's our new design standards and design guidelines that are gonna shape all the development coming forward. So guidelines are good, but it's really the standards for all new development where the rubber hits the road, because most new buildings will not go through guidelines, they will go through standards. So, so kind of keeping track of where that's happening, it looks like there's gonna be a big report coming out at the beginning of the year. So that's one to track and to be, you know, how we wanna tie that in with the work that we've done over the last 5 years. And, also, you know, how we might wanna inform them as they're debating this question of context. Because context is ever evolving, how do we pay attention to our new context and respect that, and how do we work with the ever evolving new context? So that's something that the city's working with. And there's a proposal that we're working on right now for a kind of a new initiative we're calling tentatively the Building in Balance Initiative, kind of looking at both our bigger, wider streets as well as our small streetcar main streets, and how might we want to be giving some guidance to the bigger civic corridors as well as the small ones. And there was an ABCDs of training that Sewell did, and for a long time the city has been offering an ABCs of land use training twice a year. And so for the last 5 years we've been advocating for the D for design, demolition, and displacement. And so we're very excited that Sewell, in partnership with the city, just offered the first ever training with the D. And it was a good first step. I think there's more that the community, you know, in terms of tailoring it to the community audience. But there were some good test cases that were really helpful. The Division Clinton Business Association, Linda Medikovan is my collaborator from the Hosford Abernathy neighborhood. And so she often still goes, even though she just retired from the board. She often goes to Hosford Abernathy's Business Association. I went to the Division Clinton Business Association. And so, you know, there's some ways we were trying to engage both of those in terms of moving forward on guidelines. And what DCBA is doing is pursuing some grants to help upgrade some of our streetscape infrastructure. So it's a nice opportunity to start implementing some of these guidelines. And then one great example is the new Community Visions building that just opened at 20th and Division. And it's a really lovely example of things that we put in the design guidelines to relate to community character, but it's also bigger, provides green roofs, great neighborhood services. So it might be nice to maybe do a case study of that one as a really positive example of how the guidelines, you know, helped inform that. And then lastly, I just want to mention that there's an upcoming event on October 19th. There's going to be a showing of Citizen Jane by Jane Jacobs. It's called Citizen Jane, Fight for the City, and it's going to be held at the Northwest Cultural Center. It's a screening of the film, and then there's going to be a panel of speakers. One of the speakers, maybe we'll come in front of you. So that's plenty. Thanks, Matt.
No problem.
At 7 o'clock at Northwest Southwest Community Center on Everett and 19th.
Okay.
And thanks, Matt, so much for giving us time at the early part of the meeting to share with my community what's happening.
All right. So, thank you all, and then
Alan's weighed in on the movie.
Okay, Alan's got a movie recommendation, and that is
I've never heard of it. Crippled Avengers.
Crippled Avengers. All right. Fair enough.
Thanks,
Thank you.
All right.
Matt,
Yes.
this is not really an update, it's a question. Is there a time in the meeting when I can ask a question, or is this the time?
What is your question?
So I'm not sure, I mean, it relates to committees. I was at the Sewell Land discussion with Heather, and
Yeah.
Debbie Hallcalder was there as well. And Debbie actually asked me to ask, what is the process for filling the Richmond chair of the land committee and representative to Sewell? Because we noticed nobody was there, so she just wanted to remind us that that's still open. And I think she actually may be interested in the position.
So, Eric is Eric. You're the Sewell land use rep. So, I guess
I failed. I failed to make it.
Okay,
so,
but then
yeah.
there's the land chair.
There is a land use chair, and there's a lot of other bigger discussions that I want to get to after we get through the moving forward workshop, so we can figure out what we will actually want to focus on. Some people, for example, have said that they don't think we should do anything with land use, so I want to kind of talk with the rest of the board on that first. So.
Okay, but there's interest from the community.
There is potentially, and that's also why I wanted to have the moving forward. So I want to figure out what we want to do moving forward before we commit to any specific actions on how to move forward.
Okay, but there is interest in the
There may be interest from other board members too.
Absolutely, and
You
so
know, just
that's
so it can be discussed at the right time.
yes. That's all I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to say we will not decide on that. I'm trying to say we will be deciding on that at a later point in time. So,
today.
I don't think we won't have a land use chair at the end of today. That would have to be a board vote, and that is not currently on the agenda.
But it will be in the moving forward part.
Yep. So
Discussion.
the moving forward part, I want to discuss what sorts of things are of importance to us so that we can focus on those moving forward. There are some things that are maybe not important to us that we are focused on. I want to talk about that later. For right now though, I actually want to hop into our presenters, and then to start everybody up, or to start us off, we've got Better Housing by Design project, and we've got Bill Cunningham to talk some about this.
Hi. I'm gonna have to take a moment here to connect my computer to the screen.
No problem.
Make yourself at ease. Just so you know, I've got a summary handout up front that summarizes the major proposals for our multi-dwelling zoning code update.
Did anybody else hear the TED Talk on humane cities? That was really good. I would encourage you guys to look it up. I can't remember the name, but it was a TED Talk that aired last week. And yeah, humane cities.
Security alert, that's a good sign.
Yeah, that's progress.
Yeah. Alright, and let's see here. I can actually just move this forward or back. We can move the screen forward or back.
The automatic focus?
Yeah. Well, if not, I'll get us focused in. I will do that, and we'll tip it up a little bit more.
Okay.
We have more
Is there an automatic driver or?
There's not an automatic one, so you would have to.
Maybe I'll do down.
Okay.
All right, well, again, I'm Bill Cunningham with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm working on an update to our zoning code regulations for our multi-dwelling zones. And I want to provide you an overview of what we have in our proposed draft of code amendments, which we released in May of this year. And we had a public hearing with the Planning and Sustainability Commission in June. And currently, the Planning and Sustainability Commission is deliberating over the proposals. They hope to get to a decision by December. And my apologies for you who've already seen our summary of proposals. I think Doug Kloss has seen it about 5 times. But sorry, Doug. It hasn't really changed at all, and it won't change until the Planning and Sustainability Commission makes their proposed amendments. So I'm going to sit down just so people could see. And one thing that's been confusing about this project is we've had a lot of zoning code projects lately. A couple of years ago, we had an update to our mixed-use zones, such as the commercial zones that apply along Southeast Division. That definitely applied to the corridors in some of our centers, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar that we're updating our single-dwelling zoning code as part of the residential infill project. And that's currently still being deliberated by the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And that's a huge project, pretty fundamental changes to our regulations for single dwelling zones, and it's been taking a while to get through the process. So we've been in the queue behind that project. So what we're calling the Better Housing by Design project, that's focusing on pretty much all the residential zones that aren't covered by the mixed-use zones or the single dwelling zones. And it really applies to a pretty broad range of development. You have duplexes built in that zone all the way up to 7-story buildings in some areas. And I'd also need to apologize if I'm rushing too much. I think I have about 15 minutes and 20 or so proposals. Yeah. A lot of you are aware about our goals of focusing growth in and around our mixed-use centers and corridors so that people can be close to services. The multi-dwelling zone shown in blue here, it's not a huge percentage of the city's land area, it's about 8%, but it's a fairly important 8% in that they're typically very close to our corridors or to our mixed-use zone shown in red here. One thing that people should be aware of, as part of this project, we're really focusing on changing and improving the zoning code regulations. We're not looking at changing or expanding the multifamily zone, so it's only affecting places that already have multifamily zoning. 4 major topics that the code amendments are addressing is one, about trying to promote more housing diversity, including options that are accessible. Also things about addressing the need for outdoor spaces and green elements. Also those that are addressing things more about building design, scale, and context. And then there's a batch of amendments that are related to East Portland, which I won't be going over here. First topic about housing diversity and affordability. Many of you have probably seen this image showing basically a spectrum of multi-dwelling type development, going from your larger scale and centers and corridors down to single family areas. And this is definitely the realm where the multi-dwelling zones are set to allow for. One thing we did as part of this is there's a lot of interest in promoting a diversity of housing types, and we looked at what happened during the pre-World War II period in Portland, where about 2/3 of our residential land area was zoned to allow apartments. So you've got a pretty broad mix of housing in our older neighborhoods. And we're taking a look at which of these, and all of these are multi-dwelling type buildings, could be built currently today. Our most common zone is the R2 zone. And of these, only one of them could really be built in that zone. So even where you already have multi-dwelling zoning, that full range of even low-scale housing types would not be allowed. These other types would typically be going beyond the density that's allowed in the multi-dwelling zones. You'd pretty much have to get into the high-density residential zones to do any of these 2-story courtyard apartments, which only applies to about 10% of our multi-dwelling zoning. So in 90% of our multi-dwelling zoning, these 3 projects would be too high a density, even though they're within the allowed scale. But a lot of housing diversity back then when you had that diversity. A cornerstone to what we're proposing is related to doing more to regulate by the scale of the buildings with more flexibility for what happens inside the building. Currently, most of our multi-dwelling zones regulate by unit density. Our R2 zone, as I mentioned, is probably the most broadly mapped zone, not so much in this neighborhood, but on a 5,000 square foot lot, it caps out at a maximum of 2 units. They could be fairly large units. They could be up to 3 or 4 levels. What we're proposing to do is set a maximum scale, which we define by a floor to area ratio of 1:1, and within that scale, allow a greater diversity of housing types. So it could be a pair of attached houses, or it could be a triplex or fourplex, or even more in some cases. And a 1:1 floor area ratio means if you have a 5,000 square foot lot, you could do 5,000 square feet of building floor area. So it could be a 4 or 5 1,000 square foot units.
Can we sit back for a second?
Sure.
Did you say, when you say by scale, you're talking about FAR?
Yes.
You're talking about height or floor area
Both.
ratio? Both.
What we're proposing is we're not going to increase the maximum building coverage. In this zone, it's just a 50% maximum coverage. We're actually bringing the scale down a little bit from 40 feet to 35 feet to keep it more to the intended 2 to 3 story scale, but flexibility for what happens within that building envelope. One thing we're talking about requiring, though, is if you're doing anything more than 2 units on a site like that, at least 20% of the units would need to be designed to be visitable, kind of a minimum level of accessibility, so we get more age-friendly housing. This neighborhood actually has very little R2 zoning, it's more R1 zoning. And the R1 zone is also limited by a maximum unit count, and it's 1 unit per 1,000 square feet of site area. So you have a 10,000 square foot site, it's capped out at 10 units. And the same zone, this is in Hawthorne, Ray Cost and Ladd's Addition, it's about a 10,000 square foot site, 34 units in that old building. It's 3 times the density that's allowed in that zone. What's more commonly being built in the R1 zone, you'll see on 50th, where you'll see 3-level townhouses, and this is showing something at that maximum density. They're basically 3-story townhouses. And for this zone, we're also talking about regulating by scale, more flexibility for what happens inside that scale, keeping generally the same height, the 45-foot maximum height and building coverage. A little bit more flexibility for more coverage directly on the corridors. We're proposing a new naming scheme to the zones. R2, for example, had meant 1 unit, residential 2,000, 1 unit per 2,000 square feet, and it didn't make sense anymore since we're changing the scale. And so the new scheme is RM1, residential multi-dwelling 1, RM2, RM3, RM4. Most of the zoning in this neighborhood would be in this RM2 zone. RM1 and RM2 together are about 90% of our multi-dwelling zoning. One thing to bear in mind here is we're proposing a base FAR that would be allowed by right and a bonus FAR that you could achieve by contributing to some community goods. And one thing that's been a big part of the discussion is whether or not the base floor area ratios are too small scale. Some have said we should start out somewhat larger and bonus up from there. But there is an intentional approach here to keeping the by right scale somewhat smaller to make it attractive and an incentive to seek more scale. And the things that would get you to that additional scale is, one, if you're providing affordable units as part of inclusionary housing, you can get that 50% increase beyond the base FAR. We have a new proposed bonus for affordable 3-bedroom units, where if half the units are affordable at a median income, 100% median family income, you could get a 25% bonus. And there are also transfers from sites that are preserving one of certain things. One, if you're preserving an historic resource and there's unused development potential, you could transfer some of that development potential to another site. A new one also if you're preserving large trees on the site, you could set that site area aside and transfer the unused development potential to another site as an incentive for preserving those trees. And a new one also about if you're preserving existing affordable housing, say there are 2-story apartments and the zone allows 4 stories. If you're preserving them at 60% median family income, you could transfer that unused development potential to another site. So it's really intended to get us to these larger scales, but if you're doing a larger scale, there needs to be more of a public good related to it, affordable housing, preservation of important aspects.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Sure.
I'm interested. When you say transfer, is it market-based? They can sell them?
You could sell it, or if you own multiple sites, you could transfer it from one to another.
Thank you.
Yep. And there's also an additional bonus if at least half the units are affordable at 60% median family income, so a much deeper, broader affordability than inclusionary housing provides. You would be able to get 100% FAR increase and additional height. We don't see that happening really from the private sector. It'd mostly be an affordable housing developer, a nonprofit that could probably do this because it wouldn't otherwise pencil. This is showing the multi-dwelling zoning in the Richmond area, And this medium color blue that you see, that's almost all of the blue, is the new RM2, former R1 zone. You have a somewhat lower percentage of multi-dwelling zoning than many other neighborhoods. It's pretty tightly mapped to the corridors. So you have bits and pieces on division and between the mixed-use zoning. 50th has a fair amount of that, and then Chavez between Hawthorne and Division.
Can you go back for a second?
Sure.
On Division, where there's like a larger cluster to the far left, can you tell us what street that is? Just
I think 30th is...
That's 24th and 25th.
24th,
so
25th?
Yeah,
that's
24th, yeah.
So the neighborhood starting right 29th, so more around
so the
here.
neighborhood's starting right there.
And then more on Hawthorne.
Right, not so much in Richmond itself, a little bit more across the street.
And then a higher degree on Powell.
A large part, that's the Waverly.
Right, there's some existing
That's
apartments
Oh.
here.
And that huge thing is Waverly.
What's the larger side?
This one is the orphanage
At the new target.
or children's home.
Yeah, thank you. Trillium.
One thing that's a big change for the multi-dwelling zones, and this is a particular issue in some of the busy streets, where allowances to allow small-scale commercial uses in some of the major corridors. Martin Luther King Boulevard in northeast already has some allowances where you can have ground floor commercial. Part of the issue being is that often you don't have the best street environment for residential on those streets, so there's an allowance for limited amounts of commercial. You couldn't do a purely commercial development, you'd need to meet the minimum residential densities. So yeah, there's not gonna be a new coffee shack with nothing else but that. It's gonna have to have residential. But this would apply in those bits and pieces along Division, some allowances in those portions of Chavez and 50th. So that would be a significant change, just a limited amount of allowance for commercial uses. In terms of outdoor spaces and green elements, not affecting this neighborhood so much, but for the high density residential zones, we're introducing minimum requirements for outdoor space where we currently don't require any residential outdoor space. But that's been a big issue in some areas of town, such as East Portland. Another new one is for large sites, which we're proposing to be sites that are at least 20,000 square feet, requiring that a 10% set aside for shared common area. So you'd have to go beyond just individual balconies and these larger sites and set aside area for courtyards or other common areas.
For compost bins.
Excuse me?
For compost bins.
Yep, or community gardening. What we heard from some is, especially when there are opportunities to have those in large sites, those could be more useful than small balconies if you're able to combine them into a larger shared space. Also proposals to allow some more innovative green options to count towards at least a portion of landscaping requirements. Currently, if you're doing eco roofs or raised courtyards or raised stormwater facilities, none of those would count towards the required landscaping. And this would, the proposal would allow some of that to count. Some limitations on large surface parking lots, limiting them to 30% of site area, trying to reduce urban heat island impacts. Also, stricter limits on asphalt paving because of the dark asphalt tends to contribute even more to urban heat island impacts, which our climate action plan is trying to reduce. Another thing, and this has been one of the more controversial ones, frankly, is this doesn't really apply so much to your neighborhood, but in areas outside of our frequent transit buffers, where right now we require one space for each unit, we're proposing to lessen that somewhat for small sites that are more of a individual residential lot, allowing for no parking for small projects, and for larger projects, we're reducing the required parking ratio to one space for every 2 units. This is an example that's meeting that absolute minimum parking, and there's not much room for anything else on the site. There are also proposals to extend what we had applied in the mixed-use zones for what we call transportation and parking demand management, where property owners would need to contribute towards encouraging alternative modes of transport, including paying into a fund that would go for bus passes for residents. A few building design and scale things. I want to wrap this up soon. Limitations for all types of housing where garages could be no more than 50% of the frontage of buildings. Right now, there are almost no limits in the multi-dwelling zones. And that's really intended to encourage rear parking options, and all other options are a bit less auto-oriented. New requirements for street-facing main entrances or entrances up front into courtyards. We don't have that currently in the multi-dwelling zones. And a topic that seems like a small one, but we've got a lot of input on, is about front setbacks. There have been concerns about our higher density zones where buildings are built right at ground level, and windows are often eyeball to eyeball level with the sidewalk. And there's a lot of interest from some communities too about having a bit more of a green edge to knit the higher density development with the greener street character of residential neighborhoods. So we're proposing in most of the medium density zones, including the R1, RM2 zone here, a 10-foot setback. And that's intended to, again, the buildings will be bigger, but having some of those green edge characteristics. There's a lot of nuance to this though. There are exceptions where you could match existing setbacks if that's an established pattern. If you raise a couple feet above grade, you could be 5 feet from the sidewalk so that you're at least away from that eyeball to eyeball level, similar to this. And then another one intended to accommodate courtyard housing is if you're doing courtyard housing where you have a courtyard open to the street, so it's providing a chunk of green, the building wings would be able to come up to the sidewalk. So at least you're getting that portion with that green element that really characterizes our residential streets. Another one we did in the mixed-use zones is limiting buildings adjacent to single-dwelling zones to a 3-story scale within a 25-foot distance of the property line. So you already have that in the commercial zones, and for 4-story and up multi-dwelling zones requiring a similar transition. Also, similar requirements to what we now have in the mixed-use zones to require building facades to be broken up in the multi-dwelling zones. So those are amongst the major proposals. There's a lot of nuance. I'd encourage people to take a look at the project website, which I have listed here and in the handout. Where we are right now, as I mentioned, it's being discussed, all these proposals are being discussed by the Planning and Sustainability Commission. They just had one on September 25th. They have another tomorrow, starting about 3 o'clock. That's going to be about East Portland standards and the parking ratios. November 13th, they'll be talking about a lot of the design issues, setbacks and step downs, some of the visitability standards. And by December 11th, we hope to have a recommendation from PSC. And once it's been modified and has passed muster with the PSC, it would be turned into a recommended draft that would go to City Council. We're not exactly sure when, because again, we're stuck behind the residential infill project. So it may not be until the spring or possibly early summer before it goes to City Council. And that would be a key opportunity for you to provide testimony or input on the proposals. So that's it.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a total of 5 questions, but they have to be short individual questions and ideally from different folks. So I know Heather and Doug are on the list, so you're already there. So I'm going to actually back end both of you because I know you're both really into it and I want to give a few other folks a chance. So I have never met you before, so I'm absolutely calling on you first. Can you say what your name is and what your question?
Sure, my name is Patricia Martinez, and I'm curious to hear what has been the general feedback pattern in terms of the parking reduction to this proposal.
It's very, very mixed. We've had many, it's often residents who in many cases didn't know their houses in the multi-dwelling zones who are concerned about reducing the minimum parking requirements. On the other hand, we've had a lot of testimony from people saying we should get rid of all minimum parking requirements and that our greater priority should be accommodating housing, and we shouldn't have some of the costs and complexity of fitting parking in small sites be something that makes housing difficult to do. So it's very split, a very divided set of testimony. And so that'll be discussed again by tomorrow, by PSC tomorrow. It's also, the topics come up, and one thing we'll be discussing is people raise the issue of accessible parking off-street for people who've got vans or other vehicles that are important for getting around. Currently, a lot of our zoning, especially because the transit doesn't require any parking until you hit 30 units, and we're going to discuss, is it should we be requiring one accessible parking space for every lot? There are a lot of issues about that, but yeah, it's definitely, parking's been an issue.
And I assume the studies have been out there in terms of different cities and the impact of that.
Yeah, the Portland's done quite a bit to look at parking issues and done survey work as to what it impacts
Above and
on-street
beyond
parking.
Portland.
Yes, that's happened actually primarily in projects prior to this one. But there's, over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of focus on parking issues.
Yes. Any other questions before? Potentially Doug, definitely
Oh,
Heather.
yeah.
So, Brendan.
Bill, you mentioned at the beginning about street connections in East Portland.
Yeah.
Could you give us just a couple more quick highlights of that part of the work?
We have partnered with PBOT on finding out how in areas that don't have good street connectivity with East Portland, can we get more street connections in conjunction with the new development? Because up to now, we've had almost no new street connections coming in East Portland. And so there's a bunch of tools, including new kinds of narrower street connections that PBOT's developed that could work on more constrained sites in East Portland. But also we're looking at East Portland often has these very narrow, deep sites, and looking at requiring sites to be consolidated so that there's space for streets and space for better site design before development occurs.
Interesting, thank you.
Thanks. All right. Then any other one before we get to Doug? Okay.
I was just gonna clarify for Bill, what Bill was talking about. Portland has, if I'm right, there's no requirements for any parking within 500 feet of the transit street, anyway. So
Not
all
till
the
you hit 30 units.
Unless it's over 30 units. So
Yep.
what Bill's talking about is beyond that 500 feet from the transit street.
Yes, Doug. And we're not proposing to change the existing allowance as close to transit.
All right. And then Heather. So.
So, you mentioned that the November 13th meeting was gonna be talking more about design and step downs or step backs. Can you clarify a little bit more of what aspects they're gonna address?
There have been some discussion about things like side setbacks. Some testimony was saying you shouldn't require side setbacks in the multi-dwelling zones. The space is too valuable, so that may come up. One thing that's come up by some commissioners is that the idea of allowing 0 side setbacks adjacent to mixed-use zones on a corridor like division, maybe allowing in the multi-dwelling zone building to come up right up to the multi-dwelling zone. I'm sorry, the mixed-use zone. But there are a number of complexities about that because we currently require a 10-foot setback in the mixed-use zone next to a multi-dwelling zone. So it's
So
going
would that
to
mean
circle
that
back.
they could have a blank wall?
Yes, that's been an issue. Staff's been concerned about allowing 0 lot line development because the vast majority of lots in the multi-dwelling zones have existing residential with a setback, a bit different from the Main Street commercial zoning. And so if you allow new buildings to come right up to the side setback, it'll be a blank wall to meet fire code requirements.
So just to flag that for other board members and community members, if that's something in our guidelines where we're really trying to not have a blank wall.
Yeah.
Partly because it can over-concentrate the windows on the backside where there's light overspill, privacy costs, and noise. So, something to look at in terms of other options for ways you can build to that edge with maybe a light well or other kinds of design treatments that can go into that. This other question I had that also relates to things we've advocated on were about the large building facades divided into smaller components. And so just, as we advocated, I think you guys did some great adjustments based on some of the community feedback we helped generate, but maybe not to the degree in which we had hoped in terms of breaking it into smaller building increments that reflected the pattern of the older buildings. So I'm just curious what that division is looking like for this particular project. I think it was like 200 feet, 100 feet.
There's a maximum facade length of 100 feet in the multi-dwelling zones, including what applies in this neighborhood. And you need to divide it up by a courtyard or some major break. I know this neighborhood had suggested 50 feet should be the maximum. We hope that things like the setback where you can come up to the sidewalk for a building wing of a courtyard building could be an incentive to break it up somewhat more.
Cool. thank you, Bill. And also good memory. That is exactly what we asked for. We asked for requirements reduced from 100 feet to 50 feet. And that letter is on our website, and I'll also put it in the notes for today. So, Bill, thank you for the time. And it's a lot, so thank you all for participating.
Can I just add, Bill, on the parking side, real quick, just something new on planning scene from Seattle. Just at the American Planning Association conference in Spokane, and there's a great affordable housing project that did with no additional outside funding and was LEED Platinum. And what they did for the parking is that they actually had residents sign an affidavit whether they had a car or not. They disaggregated the parking or debundled the parking cost from that. So, and then they would give tickets to people that weren't parking in their parking area. They reduced the parking significantly, but they really monitored it, and that made a huge difference to the rest of the neighborhood. Actually having a lot more support for the affordable housing and a lot more buy-in for it, because they were really, demonstrating their commitment to reducing the parking, but also managing the parking. So I have the parking code.
Thank you. All right. So next up, we have our senator. Okay. So the general format here is I wanted Senator Taylor to be able to explain a little bit about what she's working on, big initiatives for her, and then to open things up for a few minutes of Q&A. So Senator Taylor.
I just went ahead and took the liberty to stand up here because that's just
my
habit. That's what I do.
We can even pretend this is a spotlight. I'll put it on a white screen.
No, it's okay. I don't think I need that. So hello, everyone. So I'm Kathleen Taylor. I'm the state senator for Southeast Portland. So the district, Senate District 21, is just a little bit north of I-84, and then goes all along the Willamette, Milwaukee, and Oak Grove. And the eastern boundary of the Senate district that we're in, that I represent, is very jagged. So sometimes it's 39, sometimes it's up as much as 60th. It really squiggles all the way along. I have no idea. I was not involved when they came up with that, but that is the district. Where we are right now has a special place in my heart because I lived one block over from here. It was the first house my husband and I had on 34th in Brooklyn, and had both of my children, who are now, my son's a senior in high school at Cleveland, and my daughter is in the 8th grade at Selwood. So I spent many a times pregnant and walking my babies in strollers right on this very street for many years. So then we had a tiny, tiny little house, and then we had to move because my son is now 6'7", and my daughter is as tall as I am. So we had to get a little more space. So when I was asked to speak tonight, it was a little bit open-ended, and so right now I've been doing a lot of public speaking around because it is election season, and sometimes I go and talk about some of the things like the diesel meeting that I was at last week. Sometimes I talk about the initiatives. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I do in the Senate, the committees I serve on, the things I'm working on. I'll say that really quickly. I know we have a limited amount of time. And then folks can ask some questions or have me go on, so I don't want to just dominate the whole time. So I started out serving in the House and served there for one term, and then Diane Rosenbaum, your former senator, retired, and I ran for that seat and luckily won. And so I'm in the middle of my first term in the Senate. And for those of you who do not know, Peter Courtney is the president of the Senate, and he for some reason decided to give me a very, very heavy workload. So I am the chair of the Workforce Committee. That is where we work on everything from things like minimum wage, paid sick leave, things like that. And in that committee right now, I'm working very, very hard to try to pass paid family and medical leave. That is taking up a lion's share of my time. In my first session in the Senate, I passed the equal pay law. That was a big accomplishment for me. You're going to see now, starting on January 1st, wherever you work, make certain that your employer is doing the appropriate wage analysis to make certain that everyone's getting paid following the protection laws that we have now put into place. So I also...
Can I just say thank you for that?
Yeah. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Then I also serve on the Revenue Committee. That's code for taxes. Then I serve on the Natural Resources, the Environment Committee, and on the Subcommittee of Ways and Means for that. And then I chair a whole host of work groups and initiatives that, for example, I chair the Anti-Sex Trafficking Work Group for the state. I chair the Women's Health and Wellness Alliance for the state. I co-chair the Environmental Caucus for the state. I do, and then there's a whole long list of other things. Those of you who are really into politics and actually read the paper and follow what we do in Salem, you will know that we have convened a historic education committee where we have 7 members from the House, 7 members from the Senate. It is bipartisan, and we are traveling the state looking at different schools and learning about what our schools are in bad shape here in Oregon. It's probably no secret to anybody here in the room. And we have some of the worst results in the country. And we get a lot of pressure in Salem to put more money into school, and we actually do keep putting money into school, and things aren't getting better. Something's very, 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 very wrong, okay? And so I'm one of the 7 senators that's sitting on this committee. We've been to maybe 10 places around the state. Tomorrow I'm going to Coos Bay, that area, very, very impoverished area of our state. And it has been, you hear a lot about things like class sizes from the urban areas out in rural Oregon. They don't have a class size problem, no surprise. However, believe it or not, the most consistent issue that we are seeing across the state, this may surprise some of you, maybe it does not, but if you were to ask any Republican or Democrat, House or Senate, anybody who's been involved in this committee traveling the state, the number one request that we're getting is money to address mental health needs. Very interesting, right? So in addition, because somehow I drew the short straw, when I started in the Senate, I've had about, I don't remember now, somewhere 15, 20 hearings on PERS, which is a very huge issue here in Oregon. And so last Friday, I was in Eugene speaking about PERS, and I was speaking to the League of Oregon Cities. And I was surprised when I got there. They gave me their legislative agenda of what all the cities had come together and voted on what their top 5 priorities for the next legislative session was. Number 1 priority, first time ever in the history of the state, was needing mental health services for cities. Counties have been coming to us absolutely desperate for mental health services. Just wanted to share with you, there's something going on. I don't know that it's necessarily unique to Oregon, but we obviously have something here in Portland. For those of us who live in the inner city here, we clearly have a lot of people who are in need of assistance. We see that with people not having a place to have shelter at night, and not having shelter for a variety of reasons, and I don't need to go into all of that for anybody who lives around here. When I'm in other parts of the state, they ask, what's wrong with you people in Portland? Why is everyone living on the street? But for all of you, I can tell folks understand what the problem is of what's happening here. So those are some of the areas where I'm focusing for the next legislative session. What we're doing with the Student Success Committee is that we are trying to figure out a way to change our revenue structure here in Oregon. I serve, again, like I said, on the Revenue Committee in the Senate. I'll put it this way. No other state in the country wants to replicate Oregon's revenue structure. Nobody wants our tax system. We have a very, very dysfunctional tax system here in Oregon. And it is causing a great deal of winners and losers. And it's causing quite a bit of inequities, okay? And it's not working, because we have these really strong funding sources in other areas, and there's a direct correlation of what that buys, and then we lack revenue streams to pay for things that we know from polls and surveys and from meeting with our constituents what the public wants. Public wants, affordable housing. Public wants paid family medical leave. Public wants good schools. People want to have good roads. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people are asking us to provide, but there's a disconnect with our revenue system. So we're trying to meet with different communities around the state and understand what changes are they willing to make. And that's also been a very, very interesting conversation. So paid family and medical leave is, there's only 5 states that have it. I am working very, very, very hard. I just had several meetings today on this. And it's where we would be hopefully providing pay to a certain amount when one has a child. We call that bonding. Terms have changed. Care for others, definition of family. I'm advocating for a very broad definition of family. The idea of 2 people, heterosexual couple with 2 children, that's going away. That is not really how families are structured anymore. Families are structured in a whole host of different ways nowadays. And we have people with foster care situations, living with grandparents. We have all sorts of situations. So we need to recognize how the structure of family is changing, not just in the United States, but here in Oregon. And then also the care for yourself. We have some states in the country that have mandatory short-term disability. We do not require that here in Oregon. What happens is that things happen in your life, you get injured, you get hurt, you get sick, and then you can't work. And then you end up being a pretty significant cost, not just to society, but really can set you back for, with your own savings, or if you don't have someone else to care for you, and et cetera. So we know what difficult circumstances people face, and they end up in these tough situations. And so we're trying to pass this. There's quite a bit of, unfortunately, there's quite a bit of opposition to having paid family medical leave here in Oregon. So we'll see how successful I am. I can already tell you there's an enormous amount of resistance to that. But so I'll stop now and see if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
The Department of Revenue is understaffed, 700 people, 40%, billions of dollars of uncollected delinquent tax. Why isn't the legislature making an effort to collect those instead of initiating new taxes like a broken sheet tax?
Yes, tell me your name, please.
Gordon Hillis.
Yes, because I see you at my town halls, and I brought it up before. And so I think that perhaps, I know we haven't sat down face to face, so I, along with Representative Gomberg and I, are the two legislators that address the debt collection issue. When we talk about debt, we mean money actually owed to us. So there's a number that floats around, and it says the state is owed about $3.5 billion in debt. Owed to us.
That's assessed.
Excuse me?
That's the assessed amount. We don't know the unassessed amount.
So it doesn't quite. There's a report that is generated by the Legislative Fiscal Office every year, and it talks about the debt that is owed to us. Okay. Before I was elected, I was a government management auditor. That was the work that I did. I worked in the Secretary of State's office, in the audits division, worked for the City of Portland, Metro, and Multnomah County, all were as a management auditor. And so some of the bills that I've passed several bills since I've been in the legislature to address debt collection. I can go into the details, probably make you all fall asleep. But in order to bring in, I have passed several bills and have given the tools to the Department of Revenue to be able to collect debt coming into the state. Just so I don't want anyone leaving here thinking, oh, the state has $3.5 billion debt, why don't they just go get that money? Just so you know, approximately half of that lives within the judicial branch. And what that means is that when a court makes a judgment, when there's a judgment, it says, you got maimed, you got $600,000, but that person is in prison, there is no way for that person to pay that there may be a way, and if there is a way, then the court will, there's laws and et cetera about how they go about collecting that money would be paid. Even if that person, when they do get out of prison, whether or not they can pay is a whole other issue. And so then systems are set up and et cetera. We in the legislature cannot override what is decided in a court, okay? So those fines that are penalties that are assessed happen in the courtroom. So that's about half of that. In addition, in Oregon, all debt rolls up to the state. So a parking ticket that is not paid in Hillsborough goes through that period of time, then it ends up working its way up, and then it comes to the state. So there's a significant amount of that remaining half of that money, of that $3.5 billion, that is owed. Even if we were to collect the money, then we have to give it back to the local jurisdiction. Okay, so there were several things that were completely unacceptable that were happening at the Department of Revenue, and you are completely correct, sir. I would have to count all the different bills that I already have passed to try to address that very issue. And so hopefully we are going to see the collections coming in more over the next couple of years. So I hear you. I agree that the state needs to, when money's owed to us and a person can pay, we should get the money. And so that's something that I care about. So I'm working as hard as I can on it. So, yes, sir.
You mentioned, talking about revenue.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the family medical leave. In terms of revenue, and I don't understand that.
Because that would be a payroll tax.
Oh, okay, so it's who to administer it then?
Family medical and leave, I'm sorry, why don't you restate the question?
Oh, so you're done, okay, I get you, okay.
Yeah, so paid family medical leave would mean that we would pass something like maybe a 0.5% payroll tax.
Right.
Okay, and the idea is I'm working hard that everybody should be included in it. that all Oregonians would participate in the program. I don't want certain populations to be excluded from that benefit. So it would be a payroll tax. Okay, so.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Go for it.
It's a question that kind of relates to both natural resources, environment, and schools.
Yes.
And money.
Yes.
So one of the things I'm particularly curious about is when you have capital projects versus operational budgets. A lot of times that those are very distinct pots of money, and
They
you're
have
not
to be.
allowed to take from the other. And so I helped the state of California on behalf of the California Public Utilities Commission develop their zero energy schools retrofit program.
Great.
And so one of the things that they, lots of leaders gave us great input and insights, and one of the strategies was to disaggregate those two. So that might be something to think about in looking into further on the zero energy school side. One, because it gives them more resources to spend on teachers and programs, and then it gives you opportunities for STEM and STEAM, science, technology.
Yeah, so in Oregon, we already have them separated.
Right. So there's an opportunity there on the zero energy building side to be able to take from some of the operational budgets. It's not good that they're so separate. To be able to take from some of the operational, this is what they're suggesting for even local governments, to be able to take some of that for this sort of capital improvement that then you can pay back in year 5 when you get the savings. And so that's an innovative strategy that some are doing.
We had the cool school. We had the cool school investment program that was a little bit, not quite like that, but a little bit like that. I will take it back. I mean, I serve on both the committee for the Environment Committee, and then I serve on the Ways and Means for how we fund the schools. And there's an amount. The schools are in such tough shape right now. The pushback to take money out of the teacher funds to pay the due. That would be very
No,
the
don't
operationals.
take it out of that.
Well, that's how it currently. That's called the school funding formula,
Oh.
and that is one pot of money. Yeah, and then there's and in Oregon we force our local jurisdictions to come up with their own bonding. That's how, and then we have a matching program for very unique circumstances, mainly in rural Oregon, where we do a little bit of a match in some cases, but those are really small dollar amounts that never apply to the Portland metropolitan area because they're getting like a $4 million match, which goes a long way.
Are you encouraging the schools through the Cool Schools program to sort of as you, the perfect time is as you add a new roof to at least
Oh yeah, well at least
design or
we
kind of
don't
put it in their
require, I don't believe, I have to check, but I don't think that the state law would require all the school districts in the state when they're doing their improvements necessarily to do that, but here in Portland the Portland Public Schools is doing that. That's Portland Public Schools definitely is doing that, but I can't speak for the requirements for the whole state. But I am curious. I'll find out. Yes.
The property tax system that results in Unit 5, et cetera, seems to be one of the major dysfunctions in tax.
Yes, it is.
Can that be addressed at the state level?
So it has to go to the ballot, and so there are Measure 5 should never have been passed. Having restrictions on property taxes is definitely a good idea. I'm definitely an advocate of that. But that particular system was very, very short-sighted. And where we are now is about this market value versus the assessed value. And so you have two houses right next to each other where people are not paying the same. I don't know if it's because I'm an auditor. I don't know if it's because I'm a mom. I don't know what it is, but that just drives me crazy because it's just not fair. It just is literally not fair. And so we have had, we would love to change it. And we could get the votes. I mean, I think that the Republicans would side with us and vote on that. The problem is then it has to go to, they would refer it to you can have a supermajority and override the Constitution in the legislature. I don't know. We'll see how the election turns out. Don't forget to vote. So.
Real quick.
Yes, I know you probably.
Due to time, we only have time for one more question. I forgot to get to Susan's question, which was one of the ones I was supposed to send you first. So,
okay, that's fine.
Because she actually wrote it down in the survey. So
and thank you both for coming to the diesel meeting last week.
Yeah, we're glad to be there. I just have a pretty direct question. What can we, as your constituents, do to push for sustainable and robust school funding in Oregon?
Oh, isn't that great?
I mean, it's a big question, I know, but what we can
as we're toying with some different ideas. So first of all, I can't, even though I don't know all of you individually, we get all sorts of polling information and et cetera, and all of you should be very proud of yourselves because generally inner southeast is a great area to represent, and it's a great area to represent because people really care about each other. And in all of our polling, people here want to have good schools for themselves, and they want good schools for the whole state. Which is really interesting. That's not happening everywhere in Oregon, I can tell you that much. And here, I'm just very proud and happy that people are looking out for each other, and it's just those kind of very questions. I don't get that question everywhere I go, because I speak outside of my district often as well, and they're like, you people in Portland have everything you need. You got, and all those kind of things. And I'm like, it's not really that way. Why don't we all work together? But so what would be great, and you guys don't have to decide with this here, and obviously have a conversation about it, is when the legislative session starts in mid-January, we moved it up. It's starting a little bit earlier, we changed that. There are going to be hearings on this. They're calling it the Student Success Committee. And so if somebody here wants to track that, and anybody who wants to come down and testify, it would be, if you feel comfortable, having some sort of like the neighborhood association supports this, or from your school in the school district. I've met with all sorts of schools throughout my district and throughout all of Portland, of course. And what I am toying with is trying to get Portland Public Schools to bring people from all over the whole city, because basically everyone from Ainsworth to a less fortunate area wants there to be a change, which is really, really interesting. So that is something that we here in Portland are all together on, and it would be neat if through the PTA, through Portland Public Schools or whatever, that we could have some sort of representation from all different types of schools, and it says none of us are happy. Like, all of us want to have a change, which is the truth, which is the way that it is. So something like that. Okay, I'll be done.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank
Taylor.
you.
And I'm going to give her a great opportunity to get cornered. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll come back together.
If anyone has a question before I go.